We have to begin reducing the use of fossil fuels immediately, immediately, every year by a fixed percentage until by about mid-century, we've come to essentially zero, just what's needed for absolutely essentials. There is potential technology, potential. So it makes good sense to work on it. But you can't expect that non-existent technologies will solve the problem of pouring poisons into the atmosphere. The energy corporations uh, advocate that naturally. It's what's called greenwashing, pretense to be concerned about climate change, but with a footnote that says we have to keep producing fossil fuels, and maybe someday some technology will come along that enables us to remove from the atmosphere the poisons we're pouring in. But we have to continue to make profits, okay? That's crucial. Survival of humanity is not even secondary. It's way down the list. The top is ensure profits for tomorrow, okay? And it's fine to try to develop the technology, but that's not the solution to the crisis.
Thank you.
We're certainly ready. There are very clear, explicit, detailed programs for feasible ways to deal with the crisis within, certainly within the limits of our economies. The International Energy Association has come out with explicit, detailed proposals. There are others from economists, very fine economists who've worked on this topic in detail. My own colleague, Robert Pollin, has extensive detailed proposals. Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia economist, using somewhat different models, comes out with pretty much the same thing, about the same as the International Energy Association, can be achieved within about maybe 2 to 3% of gross domestic product, which is certainly feasible. They're there, they're on the table. There's even a resolution in the US Congress reiterating these proposals. It's all there, it can be done. What's lacking is the will to do it. The fossil fuel companies, of course, are totally opposed. The Republican Party in the United States is totally opposed. It's actually becoming a proto-fascist party, which doesn't even belong in the political system. Unfortunately, that's the most powerful country in the world. Other countries are, some of them are doing something, no one's doing enough. But the proposals are there, the details are worked out, can be achieved, lead to a better life, better existence for all of us, but not more profit for the fossil fuel companies. Actually, it's interesting that in the United States, the activist work by people like Robert Pollin on the ground has even brought the mine workers union to agree to move to transition. In states like West Virginia, coal state, the mine workers have agreed to a transition to a sustainable economy. The political leaders, under pressure from major industries, who are refusing to take the step. Fossil fuel, of course, but also the big banks and financial institutions, which want to profit from destroying the environment. That's the problem. The Luisa Neubauer you see the question. What prevents politicians from acting as needed? Two things. One, they are indebted to the wealthy corporate sector who they serve. That's one problem. Second problem is lack of sufficient public activism to compel them to act in the interest of the public instead of in the interests of concentrated private power. Varies from here to there. It's not 100%, but I think that's the essence of the problem. Well, what about China? There's nothing directly we can do about China, just as there's nothing directly that I can do about Germany. What happens in Germany will be determined by Germans. What happens in China will be determined by Chinese. Now, the Chinese government, at least, has said that it's aiming to reach net zero emissions by 2060. That's approximately within the range of the IPCC, the International Scientists Organization. We can try to persuade them to proceed on that course. Can't force them to do it, just that they can't force us to do it. One step we can take to persuade them is doing it ourselves.
Can you understand me? Yes. Okay. You made very interesting points about governments such as the German government needing to be convinced or brought to a point where they put the people's interests over the profit interests of the industries. How can it be achieved? What is needed to reach that social tipping point in your view?
How do we convince the EU and other
governments? No, well, the government in general.
I would just change the word to convince to pressure or compel. You're not going to convince them. Most of them would rather make money than save the environment. So, and you can't convince them, be a nice person. What you can do is pressure them and compel them. And there are lots of ways to do that. Huge demonstrations, withdrawal of support, strikes, boycotts of government activities, lots of ways to pressure governments. And it's been done many times. Take a different domain, which is equally significant, nuclear weapons. In the early 1980s, the largest demonstrations in history took place in the United States and in Europe against the establishment of short-range nuclear missiles in Europe, Pershing missiles, which could reach Moscow in 5 or 10 minutes, an invitation to nuclear war. There were huge protests against it, had an effect. The Reagan administration was pressured to join with Gorbachev's appeal to ban intermediate range missiles. 1987, they reached a treaty to ban the missiles that were causing this extreme danger. And they were banned, in fact, until 2019, when President Trump, as part of his general wrecking ball, disbanded the treaty, withdrew from it, and immediately indicated the intentions of his administration by immediately after disbanding the treaty, running tests of a new missile that violated the treaty. So essentially telling the Russians, please join us in destroying the world. Okay, that was 2019. There wasn't very much protest, unfortunately. Well, these kinds of events tell us what can be done. They're not the only examples. In fact, they're typical examples. That's the way progress is made, not by gifts from above, but by pressures from below. And we know how to do it. It's kind of like ending fossil fuels. It's a matter of will and choice, not lack of knowledge. There. How was every other mass movement started? Let's take the movement that probably has had the most impact on Western societies in the past 50 years, the feminist movement. How did it get started? Got started back in the 50s with a few women meeting, young women mostly, meeting each other, talking, having consciousness raising groups, saying, we can do something about the situation in which women are. Then it grew, bigger groups came along, more pressures, more involvement. Finally, you had a large mass movement. What about the civil rights movement in the United States? It's been going on for a century, but it really took off around 1960 when a few Black students sat in on a lunch counter, segregated lunch counter in North Carolina. They were, of course, immediately arrested. Could have been the end of it, except that the next day, a couple more Black students came. They were arrested. Then more came. Pretty soon, some young people from the North came. Pretty soon you had freedom buses, people riding, volunteers, riding through states in the South to try to encourage Black farmers to take their lives in their hands and register to vote. Pretty soon you had mass popular movement. Martin Luther King became the symbol and more or less formal spokesperson for it. Finally, you had 1 million people demonstrating in Washington. Finally, you had enough pressures so that civil rights legislation passed. Not sufficient, but steps forward. Take the anti-Vietnam War movement. Literally began with people talking to their neighbors in living rooms because nobody wanted to hear about it. Overwhelming support for the war. Well, took a couple of years, lots of difficulties. It was impossible to hold meetings even in churches without them being attacked. Finally became a huge mass movement, compelled the US government to move towards negotiation and withdrawal. Every movement in history has been like this. There are no exceptions. We know exactly how to do it. It's hard, painful, often dangerous, but you go ahead and do it.
In the climate crisis, we have a big enemy, that's the time. We can't wait for such movements to like slowly develop and then possibly push governments, industries, wherever they need to be. So how do we deal with that time pressure we're under that leaves us basically no wiggle room anymore?
How do we do it? Everything from talking to your neighbors up to participating in things like the climate strike a couple of days ago. Bigger one, more powerful one, more people involved, maybe even shut down the country if it's necessary to try to get the leadership to carry out actions which will save the human species from destruction. It's not a small matter. It's not a matter like getting civil rights or women's rights. Those are important, but not on the scale of reaching tipping points. We are on a course to reach tipping points, which will be irreversible, at which point the human species will just march towards apocalypse, basically, along with millions of other species that we're destroying. There's never been a problem like this that arose in human history. This is not a joke. We can't delay any longer. If these steps had been undertaken 10 years ago, it would be a lot easier. If they had been undertaken at the time of the Kyoto Protocol, 1990, would have been incomparably easier. Every year we wait becomes harder, still within the range of possibility. In another 10 or 20 years, may not be. There's not much time. And this is a dire, critical, existential problem. All steps that can be thought of must be taken to move the ossified political system to act expeditiously, to pursue plans that are well understood and are perfectly feasible. There's a lot that can be done by people themselves. Local groups and organizations can move themselves towards more sustainable environments in your own locality. Take where I live. I happen to live in Arizona in the United States. In Arizona, Southwest, the sun is shining almost all the time, bright sun. We happen to have solar panels on our roof. Look around the neighborhood, miles and miles, you won't find solar panels. People complain about having $1,000 a month electric bills. They could pay nothing, can't do it, because it's a liberal fraud to have solar panels. Well, that's the kind of thing that can be done in neighborhoods. It's not very simple, but it can be done, just like the anti-war movement developed, civil rights movement developed, other movements developed against enormous hostility. This time, there's no time to waste. Everywhere we live, there are similar problems. Between the parallel between the cost of World War II and the energy transition. Well, World War II for the United States, it was probably maybe 40% of gross domestic product went to the war effort, and it was voluntary. Virtually everyone was committed. I'm old enough to remember it very well. People said, yes, we're going to have victory gardens. We're not going to drive. We're going to put all our efforts into winning the war. In fact, there's an interesting comparison between, that's incidentally just to compare far more of gross domestic product than is necessary to deal with this crisis. In fact, the cost of this gross domestic product for this crisis is actually less than what the Treasury Department used to bail out financial institutions during the COVID crisis. That's the kind of money we're talking about. There's an interesting comparison between the United States and Germany, incidentally, during the Second World War. Albert Speer writes about this in his memoirs. He points out that Germany was never able to impose the kind of totalitarian control that the Western democracies could. And he thinks that set back the German war effort by maybe a year. Germany had what's called a guns and butter war. The German government, the Nazi government, felt that it was necessary to keep the population satisfied with ordinary life, so they put resources into that. Whereas the Western democracies, which could trust the population to be dedicated to the war effort, voluntarily accepted a much higher level of totalitarian control and devoted themselves to the war effort. Well, there's a lesson there. It has its own meaning in different countries. But what it tells you is that if the population becomes dedicated to a small fraction of the commitments during the Second World War, this can be handled. And this is a far more serious issue than the Second World War. You look at US planners up until Stalingrad and the Kursk tank battle, 1943. Up until then, US planners expected the war to end with a German-controlled world and an American-controlled world. That was their expectation. Not pretty, but livable. We're now talking about a situation where there's no survival. No American-controlled world, no German-controlled world, no viable world. Just, it's not that everyone's going to die in mid-century, but we will have reached a point where irreversible changes are taking place, which no known technology can deal with. There'll be no way to deal with it. And then it's on to basically catastrophe, end of organized human life on Earth, numerous other species, which we're destroying at a level that hasn't been seen for literally 65 million years. That's the objective situation. Far more serious than World War II, can be dealt with at a fraction of what was devoted to it during the Second World War.
Do we have time for another question?
Yes.
Okay. You were speaking a lot of collective action that is needed in order to prevent the worst catastrophes. Yet we see that especially neoliberal discourses, the way that societies teach their children and so on, are well, expanding an illusion of individualistic action as the ultimate thing to do. Children in school nowadays learn that it's all up on their own shoulders. Structural discrimination and inequalities are often invisibilized, whereas very few people know about the power of collective action. How can we make sure, and what is needed to inform people that the climate crisis won't be solved by eco-friendly consumer choices or by individual actions, but rather by collective action and collective mobilizing?
Well, first of all of these questions interact. Take inequality. I'll speak of the United States, which I know best, and which is the most extreme example of the way the neoliberal programs of the past 40 years have basically created a collapse of society, extreme inequality, social disorder, atomization of people. It's been a social disaster. Europe as well. In Europe, under the pressure of German banks primarily, austerity programs were instituted, which cost the population enormously. United States is worse. So there's extreme inequality, anger, resentment, fear, has all sorts of problems. It's part of the reason for the rise of ultra-right proto-fascist parties, now including the Republican Party in the United States. All of these problems are connected very concretely. So let's take the state of West Virginia, which I mentioned, a coal mining state. The economy of working people depends on producing coal. Now, the neoliberal programs in the United States have undermined the society as they were intended to do. So poor miners in West Virginia are grasping for the last hope for survival, working in the coal mines, partly an effect of radical inequality of destruction of the social order. Well, the organizing efforts that led them to accept a transition to renewable energy included proposals and concrete measures to improve their lives, to make it, to bring about proposals, government and other efforts, which would in fact improve their lives by moving to sustainable energy, overcoming the despair, the social disaster, the inequality, and at the same time, moving towards sustainable energy. They all fit together. This is very concrete. Take a look at the US Congress today, and you can see it in action. The Biden administration, which has plenty of flaws, nevertheless is trying to put through proposals which would overcome very serious human and social problems in the United States. The infrastructure is collapsing, health systems collapsing, no child care, people are desperate. They're trying to put something which will remedy it. The Republican Party is 100% opposed, totally opposed, going to block everything for a very simple reason. They know they're a minority party. They can't win a fair election. They know that. The only way they can come back to power is by harming the country as much as possible so it can be blamed on the Democrats, and then maybe they can come back to power next year. That's what we're witnessing before our eyes. And there are variants of this in many places. Take the German elections. Well, you have much more detail than I do. But as far as I could see, none of the parties that were serious had a strong climate program. I don't think any of them did. That's Germany, much more advanced country than the United States on social issues. Well, that has to be changed. In the United States, it's extreme. One of the two political parties is moving towards proto-fascism. It ranks alongside of parties like Alternative for Deutschland. That's where it belongs. Happens to be a major party in the United States, probably take power next year. Well, that's the world we live in. In our own countries, we have to deal with it in our own ways. In Germany, I think it was a big failure in the elections a couple of days ago that dealing with the climate crisis was not a major issue. In fact, apparently not even a minor issue among the parties. Okay, that's the problem to deal with in Germany. United States, we have more serious problems.